Have you ever wondered why Moses was so unique? From the moment of his birth to the very last day he walked the earth? Why did Pharaoh fear him as a baby and yet tremble before him as a man? What made him worthy to stand before God, speak face to face with the Almighty, and lead an entire nation to freedom? How did a single man defy the greatest empire on earth, part the Red Sea, and perform miracles that shook the heavens? And most importantly, why did he never step foot into the Promised Land? This is the full story of Moses, a tale of power, betrayal, faith, and divine intervention. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so we can continue bringing you powerful revelations from the Bible. Now, let's dive into the breathtaking journey of Moses, from prince to leader. The scorching sun of Egypt cast its merciless rays over the land, turning the golden sands into waves of shimmering heat. The Nile River, flowing like a divine serpent through the heart of Pharaoh's kingdom, glistened under the sky, its waters hiding both life and death within its depths. The empire of Egypt was at the height of its power, its stone monuments reaching toward the heavens, inscribed with the names of gods and kings who ruled with absolute authority. Yet, beneath the splendor of this mighty kingdom, an agonizing cry echoed through the narrow streets of Goshen, the cry of a people crushed under the weight of bondage. These were the Hebrews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now nothing more than slaves in the eyes of their Egyptian masters. They labored under the scorching sun, their backs bent beneath the whips of cruel taskmasters, their hands rough from shaping bricks for the glory of Pharaoh. But the greatest horror had only just begun. A decree had been issued from the royal palace. Every Hebrew male child was to be thrown into the Nile. The whispers of Pharaoh's advisors had spread fear throughout Egypt. The Israelites were multiplying too quickly, their numbers growing with each passing generation. If left unchecked, they could become a force powerful enough to overthrow the throne. Pharaoh would not allow that. His solution? Eradication. The terror among the Hebrew women was unbearable. Mothers clutched their swollen bellies in fear, knowing that if they bore a son, he would be marked for death. Egyptian soldiers patrolled the streets, their watchful eyes scanning for the cries of newborn boys. If a Hebrew mother gave birth to a son, it was only a matter of time before he was discovered and ripped from her arms. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, one woman dared to hope. Her name was Jochebed, a woman of Levi, wife of Amram. When she felt the sharp pains of labor, her heart pounded, not from the pain, but from fear. Would she bring forth a son? Would the child she carried be marked for death before he even had the chance to live? Hours later, as sweat dripped from her brow and her breath came in heavy gasps, a piercing cry filled the small hut. A son! Tears streamed down her face as she gazed upon the tiny child in her arms. He was beautiful, more beautiful than any child she had ever seen. His eyes, still adjusting to the light of the world, shimmered with something divine, something set apart. Jochebed felt it deep within her spirit. This child was meant for something great. But how could he survive? For 3 months, Jochebed and Amram did everything they could to keep their son hidden. The days were filled with tension, every sound in the house muffled to silence. Each night, Jochebed lay awake, fearing that the child's cries would bring death to their doorstep. Soldiers roamed the streets, their torches flickering like ghosts in the darkness. The screams of other mothers who had lost their children to Pharaoh's decree, pierced the night air. It was only a matter of time before they came knocking. Jochebed knew she could not keep her son hidden forever. If she continued to shelter him, she would doom not only him but her entire family. There was only one choice left, a choice that broke her heart into pieces. She would have to let him go. With trembling hands, she began weaving a basket from papyrus reeds, layering it with pitch and tar to keep the water out. It had to be strong. It had to withstand the current of the Nile. It had to carry her son to safety. The night before she released him, she held him close, pressing her lips to his tiny forehead. Would she ever see him again? Would he grow up to know who he was, or would he be swallowed by the waters, another victim of Pharaoh's cruelty? The next morning, as the first light of dawn spread over the land, Jochebed wrapped him in a soft cloth, her tears soaking the fabric. She carried the basket in her arms as she made her way to the river, her daughter, Miriam, following silently behind her. The Nile was vast, its waters unpredictable. Crocodiles lurked beneath the surface, waiting for an unsuspecting meal. The reeds swayed gently in the morning breeze, but Jochebed felt no peace. Her hands shook as she knelt by the water's edge, placing the basket among the reeds. She hesitated. Could she really do this? A mother's instinct screamed at her to pull him back, to run, to fight for her son. But the whisper of faith in her heart told her otherwise. She had done all she could. Now she had to trust Yahweh. With one final, lingering touch, she released the basket, watching as the current carried it away. Miriam, her heart pounding, followed the basket at a distance, her small feet darting between the reeds as she kept her eyes fixed on her baby brother. She watched as the river carried him further downstream, past fishermen casting their nets, past merchants loading their boats. Would he be found by a kind soul, or would the waters claim him forever? Then, a gasp caught in her throat. The basket had drifted into the bathing place of the daughter of Pharaoh. A woman clothed in the finest linen stood knee-deep in the water, her dark hair adorned with golden ornaments. Servant girls surrounded her, their laughter echoing in the morning air. But their voices hushed as one of them noticed the strange object floating toward them. Pharaoh's daughter. Miriam crouched lower, her breath shallow as she watched the scene unfold. The princess stepped forward, her delicate hands reaching into the water. She lifted the basket, unfastening the cloth that covered the child inside. A cry escaped the baby's lips, a sound so small yet so powerful that it sent a shockwave through the princess's heart. She stared at him, her dark eyes softening with something unexpected, compassion. "This is one of the Hebrew children," she murmured, looking around as if expecting someone to take the child away. But no one moved. No one dared to question her. A Hebrew boy. A child of the very people her father sought to destroy. But as the baby squirmed in her arms, reaching for her as though she were his mother, something changed within her. She could not let him die. "I will keep him," she declared, her voice firm. Miriam's heart pounded as she realized what had just happened. Her brother had been spared. But now, the next challenge arose. Who would nurse him? Summoning every ounce of courage in her small body, Miriam stepped forward, emerging from the reeds. She bowed respectfully before the princess and spoke with steady confidence. "Shall I go and call a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" The princess glanced at her, curiosity flickering in her gaze. Then, after a pause, she nodded. Miriam turned and ran faster than she had ever run before, back to her mother, knowing that against all odds, Yahweh had intervened. Her brother would not only live, he would be raised in the very palace of the Pharaoh himself. The golden halls of Pharaoh's palace were unlike anything Miriam had ever seen. Towering columns, adorned with intricate carvings of gods and kings, stretched toward the heavens. The walls were draped with the richest linens, their embroidered patterns shimmering under the glow of burning torches. Everywhere, servants moved like shadows, tending to the needs of Egypt's royal family. And somewhere within these halls, her baby brother now lived. Miriam still couldn't believe it. One moment, her mother had been preparing to let her son slip away into the unknown. The next, he was being carried into the heart of Pharaoh's kingdom, not as a slave, but as a prince. Yet, the irony was almost too great to comprehend. The very child Pharaoh had condemned to death was now being raised as his own grandson. Jochebed's secret victory. When Miriam rushed back to her mother, breathless and full of hope, Jochebed could scarcely believe her ears. Pharaoh's daughter, the very symbol of Egypt's power, had taken her son in as her own. And now, she was asking for a Hebrew woman to nurse him? Jochebed's hands trembled as she followed Miriam back to the palace gates. She had mourned her son, had surrendered him into the hands of Yahweh, believing she would never see him again. And now, not only was he alive, but she would hold him once more. When they arrived at the princess's quarters, Jochebed kept her head bowed low, her heart thudding in her chest. The princess regarded her for a moment, studying her worn but kind face. "Take this child and nurse him for me," she said, "and I will pay you your wages." Jochebed could hardly contain her emotions as she took her son back into her arms. Her son. She pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude. She had let him go out of faith, and now he had been returned to her, under the protection of Pharaoh's own household. For the next few years, Jochebed poured everything into raising her son. She knew that when the time came, she would have to release him again, this time permanently. But while he was still in her care, she would not waste a single moment. She told him stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She sang the songs of Israel, the psalms of their ancestors who had once walked freely in a land of promise. She whispered the name of Yahweh into his ears, ensuring that no matter where life took him, he would never forget who he truly was. But the years passed too quickly. And soon, the day came when she had to bring him back to the palace, for good. With a heavy heart, Jochebed kissed her son one last time before handing him over to the princess. The Hebrew child, once doomed to die, now belonged to Pharaoh's household. And the princess gave him a name: Moses. For I drew him out of the water. A prince among Egyptians. Moses grew up surrounded by luxury. He walked the grand halls of Pharaoh's palace, dressed in the finest Egyptian robes. He dined at the tables of noblemen, eating the best of Egypt's food. He was trained in the ways of warriors, taught the wisdom of scribes, and educated in the secrets of the gods of Egypt. To the outside world, he was a prince of Egypt, a man destined for power, for command, perhaps even for the throne itself. But deep inside, he knew he was different. The Hebrew blood that flowed in his veins could not be denied. He had seen the slaves, the men and women who labored under the whip, their backs scarred, their hands calloused from years of servitude. He had watched their suffering from the palace walls. And though he was treated like royalty, something within him stirred whenever he saw them. He did not belong to Pharaoh. He belonged to them. But for now, he kept silent. For years, Moses lived in the tension of two worlds. He was an Egyptian in the eyes of his people, yet in his heart, he remained a Hebrew. He wrestled with the teachings of Egypt's priests, their stories of gods who demanded wealth and conquest. He compared them to the God his mother had told him about, a God who promised freedom, justice, and love. Yet what could he do? He was just one man. Pharaoh ruled with an iron fist, and his word was law. Even if Moses wanted to help his people, what power did he have to change their fate? The question haunted him, until one fateful day when everything changed. The breaking point. The sun hung high over the city of Pharoah, casting long shadows across the streets. Moses had left the palace for the afternoon, walking among the laborers as they hauled stones for yet another temple dedicated to Pharaoh. The air was thick with dust, the sound of whips cracking against bare skin echoing in his ears. And then he saw it. An Egyptian taskmaster stood over an old Hebrew man, his whip slashing through the air with merciless precision. The slave, weak and exhausted, collapsed under the blows. Blood smeared the ground beneath him, and still, the taskmaster did not stop. Something inside Moses snapped. For years, he had watched the suffering of his people, had buried his feelings beneath the weight of royal expectations. But at that moment, everything came rushing to the surface. Enough. Before he even realized what he was doing, Moses lunged forward. His hands wrapped around the taskmaster's throat, his strength fueled by years of training and decades of buried rage. The Egyptian gasped, struggling against Moses's grip, but the prince did not let go. He would not let go. By the time Moses released him, the taskmaster lay still. Moses staggered back, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. The weight of what he had just done crashed down upon him. He had killed an Egyptian. And though no one had seen him, he knew the truth. He had committed an act of treason against Pharaoh. Panic clawed at his mind. He had to leave. He had to hide the body. He dragged the lifeless form into the sand, covering it as best he could. But no matter how much sand he shoveled, he could not bury what had just happened. And by the next morning, whispers had already begun to spread. Moses, the prince of Egypt, had murdered one of his own people. Pharaoh would not let this go unpunished. Moses had no choice. He had to run. Moses ran. His heart pounded against his ribs as he fled the great city of Pharoah, the capital of Egypt's power and splendor. The golden temples, the towering statues of Pharaoh, the endless palaces, it all faded behind him, swallowed by the shifting sands of the desert. With every step, the weight of what he had done pressed heavier upon his soul. Moses, the prince of Egypt, had become a murderer. The night before, when he had taken the life of the Egyptian taskmaster, he thought no one had seen. He had buried the body beneath the sand, thinking it was over. But by morning, whispers spread like wildfire. Did you hear? The Hebrew prince killed an overseer. Moses? The royal son of Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh will not let him live. The realization struck Moses like a lightning bolt. He had no protection now. His status as a prince meant nothing. The very man who had raised him would now seek his death. And so he ran. The desert stretched endlessly before him, an unforgiving wilderness of scorching heat by day and freezing winds by night. He had no food, no water, no sense of direction, only fear driving him forward. But there was no turning back. If Pharaoh's soldiers caught him, he would be executed without trial. He was no longer a prince. He was a fugitive. A journey through the wilderness. The Egyptian palaces had once been his home. The marble floors, the perfumed halls, the servants who bowed at his every command, all of it was gone. Now the desert was his home. The days were brutal. The sun blazed mercilessly, burning his skin as he wandered across the barren landscape. His royal garments, once fine and embroidered, were now torn and stained with dust and sweat. He was thirsty beyond measure, his lips cracked and dry. Yet he pressed on. He didn't know where he was going, only that he could not stop. He survived on whatever he could find, scraps of vegetation, the occasional pool of stagnant water, and sheer desperation. At night, the desert turned cold, the heat of the sun vanishing into an icy wind. He wrapped himself in his tattered robe, shivering beneath the vast, empty sky. A prince reduced to nothing. It was during these nights that he truly felt the weight of his solitude. He had no one. No mother to comfort him. No palace to return to. No people to call his own. And no God to guide him. He had heard of Yahweh. Moses staggered across the scorching desert, his body weak from hunger and thirst. The Egyptian sun had drained him of all strength, and his royal upbringing had never prepared him for such suffering. His once fine garments were now nothing more than tattered rags, clinging to his sunburned skin. Every step felt heavier than the last. His breath came in ragged gasps. His vision blurred. And just when he thought he would collapse beneath the weight of his own exhaustion, he saw it. A well. It stood like an oasis in the middle of the wilderness, surrounded by clusters of palm trees. Moses forced himself forward, his cracked lips whispering silent prayers of gratitude. Water. He fell to his knees beside the well, cupping the cool liquid into his hands. The first sip burned his parched throat, but he didn't care. He drank deeply, savoring every drop as if it were the sweetest nectar. And then he heard voices. A shepherd's battle. Lifting his head, Moses saw a group of young women approaching the well, leading a flock of sheep. They moved quickly, drawing water for their animals. Their simple garments and humble demeanor told him they were shepherds, daughters of a man who lived in the region. But before they could finish their work, trouble arrived. A group of rough-looking men stormed toward the well, other shepherds. Their faces twisted with cruelty as they pushed the women aside, seizing control of the water source. Moses watched as the women shrank back, fear written across their faces. This was a daily humiliation for them. They were powerless against these men, forced to wait until they had taken what they wanted. But today was different. Something inside Moses stirred. He had once been a prince, trained in combat, skilled in the art of war. And though he had lost his title, he had not lost his strength. He stood. Stepping forward, he placed himself between the women and their oppressors. His voice, though hoarse from thirst, rang with authority. Enough. The shepherd sneered. Who are you to tell us what to do? Moses didn't answer. He moved. Faster than they expected. His fist collided with the first man's jaw, sending him sprawling into the sand. The second shepherd lunged at him, but Moses sidestepped, striking him hard in the ribs. The others hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. And then, they fled. Moses stood victorious, breathing heavily. The battle was over before it had even begun. The women stared in astonishment. This stranger, this wandering fugitive, had defended them when no one else dared. One of them stepped forward, eyes filled with gratitude. "Who are you?" Moses hesitated. For the first time in his life, he did not know how to answer. He was no longer a prince, no longer a fugitive. And yet, something told him. This was where he was meant to be. The young women hurried back home, their sheep following closely behind. When they arrived at their father's tent, they could hardly contain their excitement. "Father, an Egyptian saved us from the shepherds today." Their father, an old but wise man named Jethro, raised an eyebrow. "An Egyptian?" The girls nodded eagerly. "He fought them off. Alone." Jethro stroked his beard in thought. "And where is this man now?" The daughters exchanged glances. In their haste to return home, they had left their rescuer behind at the well. Jethro shook his head with a chuckle. "Go back and invite him to our home. A man who defends my daughters deserves a meal at my table." And so Moses, homeless, weary, and uncertain of his future, found himself seated at the table of Jethro, the priest of Midian. For the first time in weeks, he ate his fill. For the first time in months, he felt safe. And for the first time in his life, he felt at peace. Moses awoke to the golden light of dawn filtering through the tent. The air in Midian was cooler than the brutal Egyptian desert, but it carried the familiar scent of sand and livestock. For the first time in what felt like ages, he had slept peacefully. He was no longer running, no longer looking over his shoulder for Pharaoh's soldiers. But even in this quiet place, the weight of his past still clung to him. He had been a prince, thus. Now, he was a wanderer in a foreign land. Jethro, his host and the priest of Midian, watched Moses closely. He saw something in the young man, something restless, something broken, but also something great. One evening, as they sat outside under the desert sky, Jethro finally spoke. "Tell me, stranger, who are you?" Moses hesitated, staring into the flames of the fire. Who was he? An Egyptian prince? A Hebrew slave? A murderer? A fugitive? "I don't know," Moses admitted, his voice quiet. Jethro nodded knowingly. "Then stay with us until you do." Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Moses stayed. Jethro welcomed him not just as a guest but as part of the household. He saw that Moses was strong, capable, and honorable. He trusted him with his flocks, sending him to the pastures to tend to the sheep. And so, the prince of Egypt became a shepherd. It was hard work, unlike anything he had done before. He had wielded swords in Pharaoh's court, but now he wielded a staff to guide sheep across the rugged terrain. He had commanded men, but now he commanded animals. He had once stood among kings. Now he stood alone in the wilderness. But something about it felt right. The solitude of the mountains. The whisper of the wind across the valleys. The endless stretch of the sky above him. For the first time in his life, Moses had time to think, to reflect, to wonder. Who was he meant to be? Love and redemption. One day, Jethro called him into the tent. "My daughter, Zipporah, has taken notice of you." Moses looked up, startled. Jethro chuckled. "Do not be so surprised. You are a strong man and a good one. A woman sees these things." Moses felt warmth rise in his chest. Zipporah, the same woman he had rescued at the well, had been kind to him. She had brought him food when he returned from the fields. She had spoken to him when he sat in silence.